There's a quote from the United States, probably Thomas Jefferson, um, that says, if you trade your freedom for a little security, you'll lose both and deserve neither. Well, here's the problem. It depends what you mean by that. What do you mean by each term, Thomas Jefferson? If you mean security as in some kind of hyper-authoritarian, fascistic or socialist authoritarian regime or centrist authoritarian regime, and to the point where we're living in a nanny and poppy state, then what to use the Australian description of the term, it's not literally about nans and pops, although we'll get into that in a minute. Then you're probably on the money there, Thomas Jefferson. If it goes too far, if it's too abusive in its strictness, if it's belittling and condescending, if it's denying people's rights, and then yes, then that is losing your freedom and your security. And if you support that, then you've lost both and you deserve neither. So in the case of the United States of America at the moment, they have been sold a lie where they've been asked to trade security for freedom, and therefore lost both and so neither, because the man on the pulpit and his friends were lying and had another agenda. They weren't necessarily lying as much as people like them to make out that they were. They were fairly obvious in their rhetoric. They were using, in some cases, direct quotes from Mein Kampf and Hitler's speeches, which unfortunately has been discovered by some researchers when they've gone and translated the German, and as a result, there was a man named Hawke who got posted a moment ago as a reshare. He is concerned that his country has gone full fascist because a man that he described in a different video as having been a legal migrant to the USA, who'd been in the USA for 10 years and even started a family, was just deported to El Salvador. And the executive branch of the United States government, as in Donald Trump part, gave him a life sentence in El Salvador with the El Salvadorian president, and ignored the actual court orders to say that actually that's not the case. He shouldn't get a life sentence in an El Salvadorian prison, yada yada. It's a bit concerning that we're in a strange situation to start off with, that foreign countries can and have been used by multiple nation states, that is, to host their prisoners. The sort of Britain invading Australia model that they've done with situations like Manasol and Nauru or El Salvador in the United States of America are not by no means not the only examples. I mean, there was the alleged actual terrorist groups hosted in Guantanamo Bay in Cuba as well, as an example of that. So that model of taking people that you deem undesirable in your society and transporting them to a third location and expecting that location to just deal with it and to agree with it, whatever your demands are, is an imperial type behaviour. And that sort of goes back to, that's an example. If you go back to that, if you want to see what the ideological roots of that, it's actually the European aristocracy and how that developed out of the aristocracies of the empires that were built in ancient times, some 4,000 to 6,000 years ago, perhaps even 10,000 years ago. So in the case of the English aristocracy, as it were, in the late 1700s, they'd done absolutely nothing to support their people whatsoever, and for the previous 300 years had been taken away what limited to no rights those people had as serfs anyway, and did something that was called the tragedy of the commons as part of the Industrial Revolution. So the tragedy of the commons and the Industrial Revolution went a bit something like this. For about 1,000 years or so, there was a bunch of people who were treated as literal livestock by the aristocracy, and by their feudal lords, they were expected to pay tribute unless the king's men or the lord's men came along and stabbed them or put them in the gallows. They were held captive by a religious worldview called Christianity, which actually referred to them as livestock. And while that was going on, the only piece of land that they could actually farm onto that had produce for their own personal benefit was called the commons. All other land was held in title by the feudal lords and the aristocratic hierarchy. And so the commons land was for use by everyone, and was not to be taken away by the aristocracy. So when the Industrial Revolution happened and took away those commons lands, it means that they could not produce their own food. One of the reasons why it was taken away, because in some cases they found that there was coal to mine there. So the mining industry, or the development of the mining industry, and the exploitation of that and creation of that by the aristocracy was directly involved in taking away what limited property was shared in common by the serfs in the late feudal era, and was directly related to the creation of the Industrial Revolution and capitalism. And so for the 300 years before the late 1700s, there was a gradual whittling away of those commons and a gradual movement, and in sometimes quite fast movement, of people from their commons lands and away from their feudal lords' estates to London, to work in the workhouse system for the Industrial Revolution. And if they couldn't get a job, they were basically working 6 days a week, because of course on the Sabbath they had a day off. They working 6 days a week, 18 hours a day, often for rations. In the case of the female London seamstresses, they were given an allowance of 1 shilling a month. That's roughly the equivalent of 10 cents per month income, and a ration of 1 glass of milk and 1 sardine per day. And for most of those people, that was the first time they'd ever consumed dairy or cow's milk, because during the feudal system, it was not permissible for the plebeian or the serf to consume the milk and honey, for lack of a better word. If they got honey from the forest when they went hunting, that was different. But land of milk and honey is an old reference to the aristocracy being permitted certain types of foodstuffs, even though the serfs or the plebeians were producing it. So, as you probably would know from your Irish potato famine history, about 100 years later, the Irish went into a famine because the potato got blight, and that was one of their few foodstuffs that they were allowed to consume, because things like cows and cow's milk was not for them, it was for the aristocracy that they were fighting. So there was, in the feudal system, there was discrimination based on your station at birth, and the discrimination included things like what land you could use and what food you consume. So even though there was a lot of people engaging in dairy farming, they were not actually allowed to consume, and it was for the lords and ladies' pleasures only. And that's a fact, not a lie. It changed slightly in France. The consumption of cheese and cow's milk happened slightly earlier than it did in England, as a consequence of the French Revolution occurring in the late 1700s as well. So when they overthrew their aristocracy, it meant that their dairy farmers were not expected to give their produce to the lords and ladies, and they were able to consume all those fancy cheeses that France is known for as serfs. So technically the French people have been consuming dairy since about sort of like the mid-1700s. Okay, so this is all based on the official stories. The unofficial, and this is another official story that raises some challenges and some questions. This is an official story that raises questions. So when the first fleet arrived in Sydney Cove, there was apparently a French and American ship anchored in the harbour. It wasn't just the English fleet that came with their redcoats and all those refuse convicts that were in debtor's prison. So you're talking about people who, with the convicts, you're talking about people who at most pickpocketed or were in debtor's prison because they weren't able to get work in the workhouse system, or wasn't enough for them to pay the rent in London, and so on and so forth. So they were put on prison ships on the Thames, and when those prison ships were overfilled, the anchors got pulled up and the redcoats sailed them to Sydney. And when that happened on the first fleet, there was a French and American ship in Sydney Harbour. And that's really strange and telling, because in 1788, the founding of the United States of America was only just happening, with the United States Declaration of Independence occurring in 1776. The French Revolution had happened a few years before that, okay, and the French and the English weren't getting along, and the Americans and the English weren't getting along because they were in fact fighting the English redcoats as part of the independence or revolutionary war that occurred around that time. So it's a little bit strange that they somehow decided to travel with the English to Australia, and that's on the official Australian history records. And they were docked in the harbour. That is not making any sense at all in the historical records. Unless you take into consideration that these are false revolutions, that the American Revolution was a fake and a fraud, that it was done by a group of individuals that were attempted to create a corporate-based subsidiary system as to act as false competition with the aristocracy, which is actually feeding it through the corporation system, which was invented in Geneva, in Italy, about in the 1400s as well. So at the same time as the English aristocracy was preferring to be used by French pronouns, while all the serfs were being objectified with the pronoun switch from object becoming subject as well, and the subject pronouns being taken away. There was also the invention of the corporation in Genoa, in Italy. Okay, and so that system spread quite rapidly and quite quickly as a consequence of it being beneficial to the aristocracy. Their estates could be called corporations. Their corporations eventually, by the time we get to the late 1800s and early 1900s, became people, and the corporate model got spread throughout the land as a series of nested systems, which is now controlled in the United States of America by the greatest and most powerful aristocrat of all time, Larry Fink. Have a nice day.